Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on March 3rd, 2025 for Reason to Resist. Today I'm very pleased to be joined for the first time on Reason to Resist by John Helmer. John is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own bureau, independent of national or commercial ties. Born and educated in Australia, then at Harvard University, John has also been a professor of political science, of sociology, and of journalism, and an advisor to government heads in Australia, Greece, the United States, and Sri Lanka. He's also published several books in the US on military and political topics. His latest book is Long Live Novichok, or Novichok, I should say, The British Poison Which Fooled the World. Thank you so much for joining me today, John.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri. Nice to be back.
So, John, I've been familiar with your work for many years, going back all the way to my time at the Real News Network, and I've always found you to be the most insightful of commentators on matters pertaining to Russia, but not simply Russia. And today I'd like to focus on the question of European government attitudes towards the Ukraine war and this peace initiative that Donald Trump claims to be pursuing. And to begin, I'd like to ask you a big picture question about British elite attitudes towards Russia, which is something which has fascinated me in a morbid sort of way for some time now. And to frame my question, I'd like to begin by showing you an excerpt from a press conference that Keir Starmer and President Donald Trump held on Thursday of last week, February 27th, the day before the debacle in the White House involving Volodymyr Zelensky and Trump and J.D. Vance. So here's what happened in that particular exchange with Starmer and the press.
There's a famous slogan in the United Kingdom from after the Second World War. That is that we have to win the peace. And that's what we must do now. Because it can't be peace that rewards the aggressor or that gives encouragement to regimes like Iran. We agree history must be on the side of the peacemaker, not the invader. So the stakes, they couldn't be higher. And we're determined to work together to deliver a good deal. We've discussed a plan today to reach a peace that is tough and fair, that Ukraine will help shape, that's backed by strength, to stop Putin coming back for more. I'm working closely with other European leaders on this, and I'm clear that the UK is ready to put boots on the ground and planes in the air to support a deal, working together with our allies, because that is the only way that peace will last. Mr. President, in this new era, you're also right that Europe must step up. And let me tell you now, I see the growing threats we face, and so the UK is all in. This year we'll be giving more military aid to Ukraine than ever, and just this week I've set out how we're shouldering more of the security burden. We're already one of the biggest spenders in NATO, and now we're going much further, delivering Britain's biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War.
So, John, I could hardly believe my ears in one sense, but at the same time, given the behavior of the British political elite over the last few years, this was not surprising. He said, "We are going all in," and immediately followed that with a vow to give billions more of military aid to Ukraine. Now, Trump, I think quite sensibly, and J.D. Vance and other members of his administration have been saying this war is lost, that Ukraine can't expel Russian forces from Ukrainian territory. This is widely acknowledged now by many independent military experts. And even the Western corporate press is openly acknowledging that Russia is advancing at various points along the contact line. The Ukrainians are suffering horrific casualties. This seems to be a lost cause. And yet this man is vowing to go all in. Now, could you explain to us, John, because it seems to me, and this is just one little piece of evidence in a mountain of evidence of British elite hostility towards Russia, what is the basis of this intense antagonism that the British political and media elites seem to have towards Russia generally, and particularly towards the government of Vladimir Putin?
Let me get to your answer on the specific British question by just coming back a little bit about what I think and what people do not understand about what happened last week in Washington. That's to say, what happened at the Macron meetings on the Monday, the Starmer meetings on the Thursday, the Zelensky debacle, or call it debacle, call it the truth, call it a reality show, and then the so-called summit meeting at Lancaster House in London yesterday on Sunday. You'll get a clearer understanding of this if you look at the numbers. And I've just put up on Dances with Bears this morning, Moscow time, an analysis of the numbers that Trump used and that are real, actual numbers of what the US has paid into the Ukraine war and why the British and the French are doing what they're doing. What's really happened, on the one hand, Trump has repeated several times each time he met with Macron, Starmer, and Zelensky last week, but he rehearsed the number the week before. He keeps claiming, Trump keeps claiming, the US, he put $350 billion into the Ukraine and got nothing back. Leaving aside the cognitive handicaps that Trump shows, his inability to read words, understand, or do more than understand pictures, and his limited capability to count. He can count money. It just isn't the case that the United States put in, spent, or otherwise transferred to the Ukraine $350 billion. We now know, because a report from the Special Inspector General who audits these things, these expenditures for Congress and reported to Congress every quarter. The last report appeared in Washington on February the 11th. So only 2 weeks ago, we learned there wasn't 350 at all. In fact, the number is $183 billion, which Congress appropriated. Now, I've been in the US budget office, and the budget numbers are different. Appropriation means the number has been legislated. It doesn't mean it's been spent. Actual spending, meaning dispersed money, was only 83 billion. 83 billion.
If I could just pause there, lawfully, for those who don't know, an appropriation sets a maximum, it sets a ceiling on what can actually be spent. So it can't be in excess of that, for sure.
Correct.
Assuming that the appropriation complied with American law, it would not be in excess of that sum. Correct.
So Trump has doubled the appropriation number, but the real number, the disbursement, is 83, a quarter. But when you look at what the Inspector General has discovered, reported February 11th, about where the money actually went, I've analyzed it to show that more than 2/3 of the amount of disbursement and the amount of appropriation actually went to US commands for moving more troops into Eastern Europe, their equipment, their maintenance, their operation, and their weapons. That's the first. The second largest number in that appropriation and disbursement is replenishment of weapons. In other words, both numbers represent payments to the United States itself, that is, arms makers, US commands and forces, US weapons procurement, and so forth and so on. The money didn't go to the Ukraine. The weapons did, but the money went to the US. Now,
so John, can we just pause there? Can we just pause there? Does this mean, it sounds to me like your analysis suggests that what Zelensky has been saying about the money spent and the money received is more or less accurate. Is that fair? He's been saying that the Americans claim to have spent. I think he's kind of mischaracterizing. He doesn't acknowledge the difference between an appropriation and an expenditure. But he says the Americans claim to have spent somewhere in the range of 180, and we got less than 100. What do you make of that? Is Zelensky more or less correct?
Of course, he's more or less correct that there's a huge difference between what the Americans are saying and what he received. Because he stole, he and his mates, the general staff, the bankers, the oligarchs that are still associated with him, and the entire Ukrainian establishment then stole the weapons. So the US could, in fact, charge him, as they have charged in the past, major Ukrainian officials with fraud, with having sold on weapons, and with having pocketed money. There's no doubt about that. So he's partly right, but he's as much a crook as those who benefited on the US side. But here's the problem, and this is the problem that Trump is trying to solve in one way, but Starmer and Macron can't. They've got to do it slightly differently. On the one hand, we agree, you and I, but the facts say that this war has been lost. Russia has won this war. The Ukraine, the US, and its allies have lost the war. They're losing it in every weapon system they put in the field that's been beaten by the Russians. They're losing it on the ground. Of course, we can go into, but we don't have time today, to discuss the number of military mistakes, tactical, operational, that the Russians have made, especially in the first months of 2020 of the special military operation 2022. But it has been a special military operation. It's not been a full-scale invasion. It's been something else. And the Russian calculation that a small number of forces, let's say I can't remember the number, but approximately 150,000 move in against an entrenched defensive army of about 500,000. That ratio is not an invasion. That ratio was intended to trigger a military coup in Kiev, a putsch comparable to the American putsch of 2014. Only the American one succeeded, the Russian one failed. Okay, but what we have is now, having started the operation 2022, the Russians are slowly moving westward. They still have failed to take all of the 4 regions. I can give you the percentages. They've been announced by Foreign Minister Lavrov and General Rutsko of the General Staff. But essentially, Donetsk, for example, is less than 70% occupied by the Russians. Donetsk, a major center for the rebellion and civil war since 2014. So we have Zaporozhye, which is about 71% occupied, Kherson, which is about 68%. Pardon me if my numbers aren't exactly right, and about 98% for Lugansk. But even Lugansk is not fully occupied. Now, my military sources tell me that the General Staff does not intend to fight for cities. The costs, the destruction, the time required for the Battle of Mariupol and the Battle of Bakhmut were so great that there's no intention to fight for cities. So Pokrovsk will be surrounded, but it will not be fought over. The entrenched Ukrainian defenses there will remain until they're cut off and they either starve to death or surrender or shoot themselves. The fact is that Russia is moving very slowly under tight political restriction by the president, Vladimir Putin, as we head towards a so-called end-of-war settlement or a peace settlement. In that situation, the American side accepts that they have lost. The problem for Trump, who inherited the loss, is how to make the loss look like a win for him. Now, the one thing he thinks he can do, and that's what we were about last week, is to make himself look as if he's for peace and for money back to the United States. So he's made a brouhaha that's false about how much money went in. He's making a comparable brouhaha about a minerals agreement, which is itself ridiculous, for a payback. And this entire structure is fake. It's composed of lies, manipulated numbers, and the confidence that no one in the Anglo-American media will notice. What they will notice is fact-checking of Donald Trump because those media are against Trump. So what he's doing is a perfectly reasonable effort to get out of a losing war without looking like he's running away from the Vietnam defeat of 75 or the Kabul runaway exit, the chaotic defeat in Kabul quite recently. And he's making it look as if he's going to get money back when, in fact, he's got a serious problem and they can't solve this readily. It hasn't, as far as I know, surfaced. If there is an end of war settlement, we could talk about what the military side would look like. There has to be an economic side. On the economic side, the Russians are very clear. There has to be dismantling of sanctions. Among the most illegal of sanctions is the confiscation of $300 billion in sovereign assets, money, which were confiscated at the beginning of the war in 2022. Now, that money is being used right now by the US, by the British, by the European Union, the World Bank, Canada, and Japan to pay the debt that the Ukrainians have incurred, a $50 billion European debt, ERA, European Accelerated Loan. I've forgotten what the ERA stands for. That's a $50 billion facility, of which the US has loaned $20 billion, and repayments, let's say roughly $3 billion a year, are being paid out of Russian money, stolen Russian money.
John, can I just stop you there? I'm most curious about this. Do you know what the mechanics of this are? This money is electronically sitting in the banks, the accounts of Western banks. What are the mechanics by which they've taken this money and transferred it to Ukraine? What can you say about that?
Well, I can't tell you the mechanics of exactly where the funds are located, which banks, which clearing systems hold the funds, whether they've been moved between central banks. This part I don't know. But the answer to your question is in the IMF staff report of mid-December 2024. And I stuck that in Dances with Bears this morning. And what you could see, because they've answered your question, Dimitri, by doing a very nice little illustrative box. And they show you incomes, I don't know, $5 billion from Canada. This is a lot. $20 billion from the US, £2.5 billion from the UK. So Canada's given more. The Japanese about $2 billion, and I've forgotten about $18 billion from the Europeans. Okay, the money comes in on the left side of the box. It goes through into a sort of World Bank management fund. Call it a clearinghouse, or call it a money laundering center, whichever you like. And out of that center, the funds are paid into the Ukraine, and then they come back to the lenders. That's how it's done. That's how it's planned to be done. However, if you have an end of war, what will happen? The Ukrainians will go bankrupt. Zelensky will be somewhere on the Riviera, or perhaps he'll be in Scotland shooting pheasants. Who knows where he'll be, but he'll be either dead or alive, and he'll be in exile. The inherited Ukrainian regime will say, we're not responsible and we can't afford it. So Canada, the US will have to write off $20 billion. The Brits will have to write off the equivalent of about $6 billion, because there'll be no Russian money to pay for it. There was never any intention that the Ukrainians could or would. This is an entirely illegal, fraudulent operation. What Trump is doing is a hustle. It's nothing but a hustle, more on the criminal extortion side than it's on the legal side.
So I've suspected for some time now, first of all, that these loans are in fact disguised grants because the money ain't coming back. But secondly, that these so-called payments out of the Russian stolen money is accounting gimmickry. Is that a fair sort of simplistic assessment of the situation, John?
Well, the gimmickry comes after the theft. The Russian money is being stolen. The cover story, which the Europeans, the Americans, and the British have all said, is we're not touching the capital or the principal. That's confiscated, that's frozen, that's sanctioned. What we're taking is the interest, the profit on investing these monies. Frankly, I'm having trouble understanding the difference between stealing the interest and stealing the principal.
There is no difference from a legal perspective.
You're
There's
the
no difference.
lawyer, you know there's no difference, and yet they've done it. So here comes back to your question. Macron shows up, Starmer shows up. Macron has a much better understanding of how to deal with Trump because he's been dealing with him before. He knows how to touch him for a start. Everybody thinks that was odd that Macron touched his hand and touched his leg, and that Trump did the same. The fact is that you watch Vance did exactly the same at the end of the so-called debacle reality show the other day. It was Vance, the young brain in the room, who pats the president on the shoulder, touches him to reassure him. That's exactly what Macron did. And Macron also guided him, Trump. Macron's come up with a formula that's closer to the Russian negotiating position, which would essentially allow an end of war in which you would have the Russians at some line, still to be defined, a demilitarized zone policed by a so-called assurance force. Now, Macron allows the possibility the assurance force is pointing west, not east. Starmer, who hates Russia, who's still gripped by this, and we'll come back to where it comes from, notion that Russia is an expanding empire, as it was in the 1850s against the Ottomans, etc. Macron could conceivably place the assurance force, which won't have any NATO flag of soldiers in it. That's clear from the Russian position. Will face west. Why? Because the major threat to a peace settlement is not Russia heading westward to capture Poland and all the other nonsense the British go on with. No. The risk of an end of war settlement is that the successor Banderists, after Zelensky's gone, based in Lvov, will aim to go on hating and killing Slavs, hating and killing Russians. That's why the Poles don't want to go in there and police that region. The Hungarians do. The Hungarians will come in and police Transcarpathia, the Hungarian-speaking part of the Ukraine, and they will protect the Hungarian population, which has been very badly decimated and penalized and hurt by the Banderists, by the Ukrainian fascists, by the people around Zelensky. The Hungarians will come in, but the Poles will not. So there will be an assurance force essentially to hold the fascists in around Lvov, between Kiev and Lvov. That's more like an Idlib settlement in which you keep the bad guys locked in for as long as possible, and to prevent them generating so-called terrorist attacks eastward. At the same time, the DMZ has to be deep enough to prevent long-range Ukrainian drone or missile attacks on the Russian hinterland. But the closest we came last week was the French position. Starmer, on the other hand, has a level of visceral hatred for Russia. And you ask why? Well, Starmer's I don't know much about the man.
Sorry, before you continue, you would agree with me, I take it, that it's not just Starmer.
No.
You could have said the same thing. Boris Johnson has an obsessive hatred of Russia, it seems to me. And the British so-called mainstream press, the articles I've been reading for years And I'm sure your book on the alleged Novichok
Yeah.
poisoning, explores this topic. The level of hostility from the entire British political and media elite
Yeah.
towards Russia is derangement. What
Well,
is going on here,
it's in the first place, the Murdoch press take a particular hatred line, and Murdoch himself has a grudge. The particular grudge that Rupert Murdoch has is that he was an investor in during the Yeltsin period in outdoor advertising in Russia, and it was extremely lucrative investment. But he was forced to leave. He was forced out by Medvedev and Putin with an outgoing payment of roughly 1/6 of what he valued his asset at. Now that's the sort of thing that makes a permanent grudge enemy of a deranged man like Rupert Murdoch. So every one of his papers, the Times, the Sun in London, or the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post in New York, or the Australian in Australia, and not to mention Fox and so forth, are all Russia haters because Murdoch himself is a Russia hater. But the British media that you described, yes, Novichok was a deception operation. That's what the book shows. But it was a totally successful one. There isn't a mainstream medium in the country after 7 years that's ever doubted or ever allowed a doubt to be published. Why? On the one hand, I think there's something personal and mad like Murdoch. Second, I think that you have bureaucratic hatred. MI6 exists to fight Russians without a real army any longer. What can the British do? It's so-called secret intelligence, but basically that's deception operations. It's propaganda in the English language. It's weaponizing the English language. MI6 lives and dies on the basis that Russia is the principal state enemy, and they can't quite convert to China as their enemy, and they can't quite convert to terrorism and all of those are minor enemies. Russia it goes back as an enemy for as long as the British have the imagination that they dominate Europe. And they have still the same mental framework that the Americans have, which is you must stop a Russian-German combination in Europe. Because if that works, everybody on the periphery, the Brits, the frogs, the Italians, everybody else is minor. And Germany and Russian partnership threatens the US empire. It also strategically threatens the special relationship of the British and the Americans. Therefore, it threatens the British. So I would say, with respect to Boris Johnson, I don't know much about the man, but in doing the book on Novichok, it's perfectly clear Boris Johnson saw his opportunity to be tougher on an enemy than Theresa May. So Johnson saw in the so-called Skripal poisoning and the so-called attack on British territory of the Russians a way of moving himself from foreign minister to prime minister, and he succeeded at it. So it's one of those combinations of long-term strategic fear of a European development that renders England a mere island. And after all, they've done that to themselves. Brexit has done it to themselves, so that their real long-term strategic position in Europe, they weakened all by themselves. Leaving aside the strategic history back to the Crimean War, the British have particular elements of their elites that profit from this, and it's impossible to shake it. At the same time, the British people are pretty tolerant, unusually tolerant, unusually capable of understanding that this is wrong, this is false. Whether you're a Scot or a Welshman or a Cornishman or even an Englishman, you're skeptical.
Right.
But this is not the way it is anymore.
Right. So during that same clip that we showed our audience, Starmer said that the United Kingdom is prepared to commit boots on the ground.
Yes.
I would have thought, John, based upon the totality of the evidence, that there already are British
Yes.
boots on the ground, although perhaps not in large numbers. What is your understanding of the presence of British forces and intelligence, other security services in Ukraine at this time?
It's been quite important in some sectors. As best I can tell from the Russian military bloggers and other reports, not personal sources, the British have played a major role in directing Ukrainian naval drone warfare based around Odessa, aimed at Russian shipping in the Black Sea. And they've drawn very heavy missile attacks as a result, as the Russians have increasingly intensified their destruction of the war-making potential around the docks area and the port and seaboard around Odessa. Not the city, but the seaboard. There's a very big British element in that. The British have also contributed all sorts of special forces operations. There've been some talk, and there was some evidence that they were assisting the Ukrainians in devising a dirty nuclear bomb, a dirty nuclear attack around the Zaporozhye plant, the nuclear power plant, around the Dnieper River, and so on, about which there's been no evidence of an attack, an underwater attack, a dirty nuclear attack. But there's plenty of evidence that the British were assisting the Ukrainians. How much more training they did of special operations, I don't know, but they did. So let's say there are lots of staff officers, lots of technical officers, or technical NCOs, sergeant level, corporal level. More than that, I don't know. And obviously, to the extent that the Ukrainians were firing Storm Shadow missiles, British-made missiles, there had to be a substantial crews, British crews, technical crews, running the radars, running the guidance, connecting their targeting data with the US satellite systems and with the British aircraft. There were British aircraft, reconnaissance, AWACS type aircraft based out of Romania, flying circles in the Black Sea, which did a number of things. One was to identify where the Russian anti-aircraft radars were, to find pathways for missiles and drones to enter Crimea and attack targets. The British have been very active in that. But let's call that paper warfare, but it's very significant. And the Russians have hit them.
Undoubtedly. Repeatedly, I would think. Now, John, I want to switch gears, but again, returning to this press conference, there was a quite interesting exchange between a reporter who I believe was from Canada and
Yes.
Starmer and Trump, relating to Trump's now infamous vow, or shall we say dream, to make Canada the 51st state of the United States. So let's share this with our audience, and I'd like to ask you about it.
Can you explain how you came to this belief that foreign governments are paying tariffs? And for the Prime Minister, did you discuss with President Trump his repeated statements of desire to annex Canada? And has the King expressed any concern over the President's apparent desire to remove one of his realms from his control?
Okay, so we're going to skip over Trump's response to the tariff point and go straight to Starmer's response.
Look, we had a really good discussion, a productive discussion, a good discussion, as a result of which our teams are now going to be working together on an economic deal. Our teams are going to be working together on security in Ukraine. You mentioned Canada. I think you're trying to find a divide between us that doesn't exist. We're the closest of nations, and we had very good discussions today, but we didn't discuss Canada.
Thank you. Please. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yes.
Now, let me point out, John, as you and I discussed before we began this interview today, that there's some uncertainty about what Starmer said at the very end before Trump said that's enough. There's uncertainty as to whether he said we did discuss Canada or we didn't discuss Canada. Now, I understand you have a very interesting take on all of this, which doesn't necessarily depend on whether he said did or didn't. Could you please explain to us what your interpretation of this interaction is?
Well, it came out of the blue, the question. It was a very important question, and the reporter asked in a very polite way. What was extraordinary was that Starmer wasn't ready for it. On the one hand, his first reaction, as you've just heard, was, you're trying to divide us between the United States and Britain. We're together. And he attacks the reporter for asking a perfectly reasonable political question about the third country, which happens to have as its king, King Charles III, the monarch, whose invitation to Trump to have a sleepover at Buckingham Palace was one of Starmer's ideas of how to soften up the president for what Starmer's agenda was. So here is Starmer presenting at the beginning of that Oval Office press opportunity a piece of paper on which Charles says, you're invited to my sleepover, bring your pajamas, we'll have a party. And then Starmer announces that this has never happened in the history of pajama parties and sleepovers at Buck Palace before. I mean, it's nonsense. It's nonsense that the calculation of a British Prime Minister should think that the vanity of the President of the United States is so great and so simple as to fall for that. But he's probably right. Trump thinks that's the case, and anyway would think it'd be great for business, his various golf course and other hospitality businesses in Scotland and elsewhere. So this is Starmer trying to lick Trump's ass. Then, when somebody dares to mention Canada, part of the British Empire, part of the King's dominions, Starmer loses his temper to a degree that's unusual. By the way, Starmer's a liar. Starmer's a very peculiar fellow who claims to have in his bio about how he loves the resistance to Russia. He claims to have been the lawyer for Marina Litvinenko in her court cases to pursue the Russian responsibility for poisoning Alexander Litvinenko with polonium in 2006. That's a complete lie. I mean, there have been some very important high court cases, but there's no sign that Keir Starmer was ever a lawyer in any of it. Why would he lie to portray himself as, a heavy on the hate Russia side? I don't know. But in any event, he does, and he thought that he could influence Trump with this invitation. Then the reporter comes and says this. Starmer attacks him and then whispers either we did discuss Canada or we didn't discuss Canada. And then Trump, shows suddenly more brains than usual, says whatever is, that's enough. And then he goes to another part of the room. He cuts it off because it's a dangerous topic. He recognizes it's a dangerous topic. What's unusual about that? Well,
sorry, John, according to the rules governing these press conferences, I understand that this reporter had an entitlement to a follow-up question. Is that correct? That would have been the convention. So Trump deprived him of the opportunity to ask a follow-up question, right?
Correct.
Right.
That's
Okay.
quite right. He had the
Yeah.
right to follow up, and he was going to follow up. And he would have said, Mr. Prime Minister, did you say you did discuss it? If you did, what did you say? Or if you didn't discuss it, why the hell you didn't?
Mhm.
But Trump clearly stopped it. It's perfectly obvious what would have been said, and it would have been even more dangerous. And Canada, in the election running, as we see it now, Canadians would have and should have been incensed by what happened. That there was a British Prime Minister betraying Canada, its own dominion, for a mess of pottage. What for the 26 pieces of silver? What were his 26 pieces of silver? He wanted, as he said, to have some relief of US tariffs against British trade. That was the principal 26 pieces of treasonable money that Starmer was in Washington for. And he didn't want Canada, the empire, the Dominion, to get in the way. He betrayed Canada for the 26 pieces of silver. That's what he did.
And I must add, John, whatever was said or not said in the private discussion between Trump and Starmer, Trump has said repeatedly that he wants Canada to become the 51st state. He has repeatedly referred to Justin Trudeau as the governor. He has made no bones about what his aspirations are to be Canada. And Starmer said unequivocally, there's no division between us. You know, we are united. He didn't say we are united on the question of Canada, but it seems to me that the implication of this declaration of unity between the United States and Britain is, at a bare minimum, the British government doesn't oppose what Donald Trump is trying to do vis-a-vis Canada.
Correct.
Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
I do. And I just ask you, why hasn't Mark Carney, who's running for Prime Minister, said something about this? I mean, we understand that Justin Trudeau will be visiting King Charles today, and we'll see the spineless meet the gutless. Okay, there's nothing Justin Trudeau can do now to save Canada from Trump, but Mark Carney could, and Mr. Poilievre could. But why hasn't either of them had anything to say about this extraordinary betrayal? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that Starmer would sell out Canada in a heartbeat if he thought it was in his own personal interest, the interests of the British elite to do so. Now, since we're on the subject of Canada, John, you've written extensively about what I regard as a notorious political figure in Canada, Chrystia Freeland. And you've taken, I think, a considerable amount of heat, if I recall correctly, from the Canadian media because of your trenchant commentary, but entirely justified critique of Chrystia Freeland. Right now, as we speak, the governing Liberal Party is holding a vote. It's taking place over a period of about 10 days, I believe, concluding in about a week's time, about who is going to replace Trudeau. I personally have believed for many years that at a national level, Chrystia Freeland is unelectable, in part for the reasons you have written about, but also just because she's got now this baggage of this disastrous proxy war, and she's just not a likable person at all. It's one thing for Chrystia Freeland to win a seat in Parliament in the very wealthy riding in Toronto of Rosedale, and then to be appointed to ministerial positions by the Prime Minister for whatever reasons he may have had to do that. But it's quite another thing for her to be elected Prime Minister. So I personally think it's very unlikely she's going to defeat Carney. I think Carney is likely to be the victor. Nonetheless, I'm interested in your thoughts about what kind of a Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland would make were she to pull a rabbit out of a hat and defeat Mark Carney in this vote.
Well, I'm smiling. Look, here are my credentials to speak about Canada. Everybody can hear my accent is not Canadian. But I learned a great deal about Canada from falling in love with a Canadian woman many, many years ago. Her name was Melinda McCracken. She was a reporter for the Globe and Mail in Montreal, and we spent some time together. Unfortunately, I was so miserable in Boston at the time. Melinda couldn't save me. And she went on to her life in Winnipeg. She wrote a very marvelous little book called Memories Are Made of This. And then she died very young, very sadly. But to learn about Canada from somebody like Melinda McCracken was, let's say, still with me as something that makes me very fond of Canada. Second, I adore Glenn Gould's music. Glenn Gould, to me, is the greatest of all Canadians. He showed great courage when he came to Moscow. All the Russians loved him. And one of the great things that Glenn Gould said when being asked about whether he was an absent-minded driver, what Glenn Gould said was, sure, I've gone through a few red lights, but I've also gone through a lot of green lights and never got any credit for it. Now, that particular wit is particularly Canadian, in my opinion. It's particularly unique of that great pianist, and his bravery in confronting Lester Pearson and confronting the United States, which tried to stop him going to Russia to play, is something that Canadians, I think, need to remember now. Canadians can stick up for themselves, and against an underdog, as the underdog in this particular fight, I'm with them, and with that background. Now, unfortunately, I was the reporter on Canadian business in Russia at the same time that Chrystia Freeland was the editor of the Globe and Mail in Toronto at the time. And I had to deal with her at the time. My own opinion about her professional competence is that she behaves like a small person. That's a physically small person who's always got a chip on their shoulder in dealing with tall people. She could not bear then to be, let's say, corrected on any matter. She's in Toronto. I'm in Moscow. I'm 6'3". She's, 5'3". She was always against anybody tall crossing her. And then she would start to scream. The person has no self-control when challenged. Small people in politics learn to act faster than anybody else, and get in between opportunities. She thinks she's not small. She thinks she's huge. And she uses very unpleasant bullying tactics to do that. When you say she's unlikable, everybody knows that Chrystia Freeland is unlikable. She's actually unbearable. But she's capitalized with George Soros's support. She was to have written George Soros's biography, Ho-Hum. That was what she was engaged to do before she started the Rosedale campaign and entered Canadian politics. This person is a bad person for a society that's complex, has got many different groups, Black, First Nations, white, poor. She has no empathy with these people, none. She can pretend to reflect women's votes. I think I knew better about Canadian women from Melinda than I ever learned from Chrystia Freeland. She's a unlikable, unelectable person as Prime Minister. Were she to be a Prime Minister, then what you would see is what she inherited from her fascist grandfather. She steals, she will rob from one class, she will benefit another group. She's dishonest. I mean, the stuff that you referred to that I uncovered, largely a result of research done by Canadians out in Alberta, that reflected not only in her inheritance of her fascist grandfather, who arranged that Jews would be murdered, so he took the printing press, the car, the antiques, their apartments, and so on. Never mind that. She can deny all that, and she can certainly pledge allegiance to the Israeli lobby and so forth and so on. What she inherited is a fascist mind. a mind that doesn't tolerate opposition to her, resistance to her, difference from her. And in that sense, she's dangerous. She's dangerous. She was dangerous to Trudeau's political advancement, but he couldn't see it. His mother could. But she eventually, okay, too late, Trudeau fired her. He should not have promoted her. He could have gotten rid of her a long time ago and should have. She shouldn't be running as a contender now if Trudeau knew how to conduct politics in any country, let alone Canada. But as a prime minister, if she wins, she will be intolerant and vicious.
Yeah. And, John, we had this disgraceful spectacle last year of virtually everybody in Canada's parliament giving not one but two standing ovations to an out-and-out Nazi, Jaroslav Hunka. And, when my read on what happened there was, the Israel lobby in Canada has tried very hard to avoid this whole issue of neo-Nazi sympathies within elements of the Ukrainian-Canadian community. But it became notorious on social media very quickly. People realized who this man was very quickly. There was an uproar. And I think that the major pro-Israel organizations were forced by their membership to condemn what had happened. And at that point, the Trudeau government had to apologize. If the Israel lobby hadn't been forced to attack, they would have just let this go. They would not have said anything, ignored the commentary on social media, but they had to do something. So at that point, they trot out this, they throw the Speaker of the Parliament under the bus. They say he did this and we had nothing to do with it. And, he's going to resign and do the honorable thing. So he takes a bullet for the team. But I can't believe, John, that Chrystia Freeland didn't know who that man was and that she wasn't made aware before they stood up and gave him two standing ovations that he had been a volunteer in the Galicia SS. What's your thoughts? Do you think there's any realistic prospect that Chrystia Freeland, with her extensive knowledge of Ukrainian history, particularly during the Second World War, was unaware of this man's past?
I honestly don't know, Dimitri. It was on the one hand, as you say, the unanimity of the Parliament standing up to give him 2 rounds of applause the way they did showed a level of disgraceful herd mentality, where some people clearly knew, and those people who clearly knew were the Ukrainian Congress people, and one must have to think that Chrystia Freeland would have been aware of who he was. It wouldn't have taken a couple of seconds before she'd found out during the standing ovation if she didn't already know. And remember, it took some time for the Speaker to approve a bunch of invitations to meet with Zelensky in the Speaker's room before they went into Parliament and so forth and so on. But equally, as you've just said, it was totally discreditable the way in which the Trudeau government then tried to back away, blame the Speaker for what happened. How can you blame the Speaker for the invitation when everybody stood up and applauded? Everybody has that fascist stain on their foreheads, but they don't think so. And the Jewish community, the Israel lobby, act cynically. It has its own genocide to defend, and it's not going to make too much noise about the German one or the Ukrainian one. Somebody like Freeland has defended both.
Right. So, the last question. We're almost out of time, John, but I'm most curious to have your thoughts on the perspective of the Russian government right now to these peace overtures from the United States. We're hearing reports that Russia would welcome, in the right circumstances, including and particularly a peace deal that is acceptable to it, some level of U.S. corporate investment in specific projects involving Russia, perhaps in the Arctic, for example, where there are believed to be massive natural resources that are becoming increasingly exploitable. Do you think there's any risk? Putin has been criticized in the past for having trusted the United States government and other Western governments too much. Do you think that there's any risk at this stage of that happening again? Or do you think that Putin and his inner circle have learned their lesson?
Politics being what they are, and President Putin being a politician who has to accommodate conflicting constituencies, the political drivers for Putin can encourage him to make mistakes. Now, I've tried to write about the way this president thinks. He is an exceptional mnemonist. That is to say, he has one of the most extraordinary memories among politicians in Europe, and certainly in Russia. He has an extraordinary memory. And mnemonists, people with extraordinary memory, don't necessarily think analytically or even strategically. They memorize without necessarily understanding the moves ahead that make strategic analysis or effective predictive analysis possible. President Putin makes predictive, future, or strategic mistakes, and he makes them over and over. On the other hand, he displays particular qualities of memory of the past that no one can match him for, no one in Russia or in the West. At the same time, he is a very capable politician who has to manage conflicting constituencies. One of them is the oligarch system created by the United States and the Yeltsin administration in 1996. And Putin continues to favor oligarchs and their control of major sectors, aluminium for Oleg Deripaska, steel for Mordashov and Vladimir Lysin and others. The oligarch structures want business as usual. The oligarch structures were heavily invested in the United States, sometimes at considerable losses. They invested stupidly, unwisely, at premium prices in US steel assets and took a bath. President Putin has recently endorsed the ambition of Oleg Deripaska to break into the US aluminium market, undercutting Canadian aluminium for price, bringing and making his part of the Russian economy open to US investment for low-priced aluminium. We've been through that before. Alcoa was his partner a long time ago and was booted out. But Putin is very sensitive to the possibilities that are raised by the oligarchs, many of whom have houses and other assets, toys, properties. Roman Abramovich has a ski lodge in Colorado and a row of houses in upper Manhattan. Deripaska has a palace in Washington, D.C., and so on and so on. And there are others who have palaces in Florida near Trump's residence and so on. There is an oligarch interest in restoring business with the United States. There is a political interest in making the U.S. business lobby an effective spokesman for peace, for meeting Russia's demands for reducing and eliminating economic warfare. For that, Putin has appointed his own special representative for money. That's Kirill Dmitriev, the chief executive of the Russian Wealth Fund, known as the Russia Direct Investment Fund. Dmitriev speaks good English. He was educated in the United States. He was in Goldman Sachs for a while. And he has a particularly primitive notion that money produces political power in Washington. And that's what motivates one line of Putin's thinking. That's Dmitriev inviting US investors into, let's say, Novorossiya. If you have US investment in these new regions, that's de facto political recognition that they are part of Russia, that they are protected by Russia, not by the Ukraine. Similarly, in a competition in the Arctic, the theory is that business and money will lobby US administration decisions favorable to common interests. And they will be common interests, that's true. The counterpart on the US side for Dmitriev is Stephen Witkoff, or Witkoff. He's Trump's money man. So it's money talking to money. And this is one line of potential negotiation. And Dmitriev did a lot of advertising of that in the Western press, as you saw, in Riyadh. He, in fact, spoke more to the Western press than Foreign Minister Lavrov or presidential foreign policy advisor Ushakov. And he keeps pushing himself into the FT, the Bloomberg, Reuters, and what have you. It's a primitive notion that this line will change underlying US military and strategic opposition to Russia. But for the time being, it's potentially progressive. It's much easier to negotiate, let's call it what Trump calls it deals, I'd call them hustles, cons, than it would be to negotiate a military end of war settlement, terms of military security. That's much more difficult and has been made much more difficult by Trump's removal of General Brown from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his substitution for a Spetsnaz, a special forces soldier like Kane, General Kane. Military negotiation, very difficult, and is not apparently underway. Diplomatic negotiation is underway, but is at a level of restoring the diplomatic relations which were savagely broken over the last few years. So all of these things are operating sometimes at cross purposes. And frankly, after all we've said about Trump's incapacity, the need to show a win for money, if not on any other score, to end this war, we have the possibility of a big juicy worm dropped on a line by Mr. Dmitriev towards the United States in the hope that somebody will bite and that Russia will benefit. As I say, I think it's a very primitive political notion. It's understandable why they think that, but ask the Arabs who spent 2 generations trying to use their money to influence Washington against Israel, and the Arabs will tell them it doesn't work, and the Greeks the same, and the Armenians the same.
Right. I have to ask this question. It's very related to the one we've just discussed. So, the Trump administration has not been shy about wanting to pry Russia away from the People's Republic of China. This is a big question, John, but also very interested in your thoughts on this. Do you think there's any realistic prospect of that happening? Let's suppose that these overtures and these business opportunities and so forth materialize into concrete business projects of mutual benefit to the United States and the Russian Federation, and that they come to terms on ending the Ukraine war that are acceptable to both the United States government and the Russian Federation. Do you think that this is going to have negative implications, major negative implications for Russia's economic and political relations with the PRC? Or do you think there's no realistic prospect of the Trump administration driving a wedge between Russia and China?
It's pretty clear, and it's been clear since Brzezinski wrote his book about European strategy, that the Americans think that they can drive a wedge between China and Russia, between Beijing and Moscow. It's also clear that there's a great deal of racism on both sides. There is a US, an American racist attitude towards China, and it reflects itself in the notion that why shouldn't the white races, that's the Americans and the Russians, combine against the so-called yellow races like the Chinese? We could also see racism reflect itself in the Russian-Indian relationship and the way the US tries to break India away from its relationship to Russia. Since the collapse of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria and the Russian exit, abandoning Assad, it's been incumbent on the Russians to go explain to their allies and friends that they won't do it to them. And that's exactly what Foreign Minister Lavrov had to do in Johannesburg last week, meeting with Mr. Jaishankar, the Indian Foreign Minister, meeting the Chinese Foreign Minister and the Algerians and the others, all of whom are, let's call them, Russian allies, not as strategically close as the Chinese or the Indians. So the notion of splitting is an American idea. The level financially, the dollar value of Russia's links to both India and China dwarf what Kirill Dmitriev is currently talking to Stephen Witkoff about. And Trump and his family, Trump and his friends, Witkoff, these are real estate speculators. These chaps think that that $1 billion for a casino on a beachfront, on a boardwalk, is a very big business. And it is for them. But compared to state relationships, it's a tiny business. And fundamentally, if one looks at the fundamentals of then Russia, China, and India have a degree of closeness which can be interrupted, disturbed, interfered with, messed about with, yes, but underneath it, and maybe I'm speaking wishfully here, underneath it all, the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians can maintain a trust at a strategic level because they share strategic objectives. And the way in which Trump is behaving encourages the Chinese and the Indians to think they can make their opportunities with the chaos Trump is causing without necessarily thinking that the Russians would be so stupid as to fall for it. I think that's what the Chinese and Indians think. I think that they are right. The Russians aren't that stupid. But on the other hand, you get a chap like Mr. Dmitriev who thinks he's terrifically smart and has got the bit in his teeth. He's got a mandate from the president to negotiate big deals, and the money's big enough to leave a lot of it falling off the truck. And without getting into who would benefit from the bribery, let's put it this way: the Trump regime has institutionalized bribery already. Last week they announced that they're replacing the business investment visa for foreigners into the United States with a gold card. $5 million will buy you a residential ticket to citizenship. And you can bet your life the bribery will be involved because somebody asked Trump, who was announcing the gold card with Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, well, do you think Russian oligarchs will qualify for this card? And Trump said, why not? Why not? I know a lot of nice oligarchs. Well, that's an open invitation to bribery, and that's institutionalized. When that's the basis of luring the United States business back into Russia, based on economic foundation as weak as that, nobody in their right mind believes that's secure and stable. Right. Not on the Russian side, not on the American side.
Right. Well, John, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for giving me so much of your time today. And I hope we'll be able to continue this conversation in future.
Thank you, Dimitri. Good luck to you. Good luck to us all. Good luck to Canada.
Good luck to Canada. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on March 3rd, 2025.